Reformation in the life and works of John Dьюри and Dorothea Mur Dьюри. It's again the 17th century and even partly the Netherlands, but of course England too. By the beginning of the 17th century, Reformation in England had formally been complete. Anglican Church was the state church, monasteries were closed, and the independence from Rome had existed for many years. Nevertheless, a large number of Protestant sects appeared, and lots of people felt unsatisfied with the results of the Reformation of the 16th century. Protestants in Europe were not united at all. Although the events of the 30 Years' War made Protestant states join forces against the Catholic countries, above all Holy Roman Empire. The violent events of the first half of the 17th century influenced those Protestants who were seeking unity and peace. Among them were a Scottish Calvinist minister and preacher, John Dьюри. He lived from 1596 to 1680, and his wife, Dorothea Mur Dьюри, she lived from 1612 to 1664. For John and Dorothy Dьюri, Reformation in England was not finished at all. Although the term further Reformation, my Dutch doesn't exist, *Ledere Reformatie maybe, is generally associated with Puritans and Dutch Calvinists, it has much broader significance, in my opinion, and can be applied to other movements within 17th century Protestantism as well. The representatives of further Reformation strove to increase the impact of the Reformation of the 16th century and wanted to reform church, state, and society in depth. The term itself dates back to the 16th century and probably has its origins among English Puritans. One of the leading figures in further Reformation movement was the English Puritan William Amesius, who lived in the Netherlands and was professor in Franeker in the years 1620 to 1633. Another important representative of this movement was the pastor from Middelburg, Willem Teylink. Both men made a considerable influence on the central figure in 17th century further Reformation, Gisbert Vucius, in Russian Gisbert Voetzig, the famous opponent of Descartes. Vucius was influenced by Ames's and Teylink's ideas, especially by Ames's goal to make even students' life holy. The holiness of both personal and public life was one of the central issues for the representatives of the further Reformation. Vucius connected piety and scholarship and also considered all knowledge practical. He thought that science should serve piety. Наука на службе у благочестия. Vucius was very active in philosophical and theological disputes of his time. The most famous one, I have already mentioned it, was his dispute with Descartes. He was not a tolerant man, hating Catholics, philosophers, and foreigners, but at the same time, he was very good at depicting sinful life and life under the grace. Vucius was one of the founders of the newly established Utrecht University in 1636. Thus, he was able to link the theoretical issues of his program of the further Reformation with the practical application. Among his close friends was Anna Maria van Schurman, a woman polymath and the first university student in the Netherlands. Herman Selderhuis makes an important division between the so-called ecclesiastical pietism, both Lutheran and Reformed, and separatist or radical pietism. Further reformation of Gisbert Vucius did not aim at separating from the Reformed Church. Vucius and his followers wanted reform within the existing church. On the other hand, there were Protestant sects that were unsatisfied with the existing church. One of those was the sect of Labadists, the followers of Jean de Labadie, a Frenchman who wanted to create a church without spot or wrinkle. At first, Vuchers was positive about Labadie's arrival, but then they had an argument which was worsened by Anna Maria van Schurman's transition to Labadists. Vuchers and his friends considered her act to be very deplorable. Schurman became one of the leaders of Labadists, and her last years were spent in spiritual satisfaction. Selderhuis also speaks about the third force in 17th century religious and intellectual life. Quote, various mystical, spiritualistic, international movements around people who tried to give their own answer to the challenges of rising skepticism. Among those were millenarianists, who have long been a marginal movement in the entire Christian church. The idea of the millennium, тысячелетие царства Христа, dates back to the first centuries of the Christian church. Among the most famous early millenarianists was Tertullian. Millenarianism was condemned by the church fathers, for example, by Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, Saint Gregory the theologian, Святой Григорий Богослов. The new wave of millenarianism was during the Reformation, especially among the Anabaptists. In the 17th century, the idea of millennium found its way to various Protestant sects. Labadists acquired it, as well as independents in England. One of the leading figures in 17th century third force, the Walloon minister Peter Serrarius, also supported the idea of the millennium. Among his followers were also representatives of the Protestant sects other than Lutheran or Calvinists, for example, the last bishop of Moravian Brothers, the founder of modern pedagogy, Jan Amos Comenius. Two Comenius' friends from England, Samuel Hartlib and John Dewey, were prominent millenarianists. Being representatives of millenarianism, Hartlib and Dewey did not pass time in silent expectation of the future millennium. They were active in speeding up the millennium. In this context, the idea of the further Reformation springs up. For Hartlib and Dewey, as well as for Gisbert Vuchers, the Reformation had not been finished. Moreover, there is a private aspect of the problem, because Dewey maintained close contacts with Vuchers, as he helped his future wife's, Dorothy Mur's sons, to get a place in Vuchers' school. John Dewry, Vuchers, Dorothy Mur, and Anna Maria van Schurman all belonged to the same network of friends and scholars. Therefore, their aspirations may be considered within the same stream, further Reformation movement. John Dewry did not aim at separatism. On the contrary, he worked towards the unity of Lutherans and Calvinists in continental Europe. He wanted ecclesiastical pacification between Lutheran and Calvinist churches, and Tom Webster calls his plan among the grandest. Dewey carried out his project from 1628 to 1680, the year of his death. Unfortunately, his activities proved to be unsuccessful. Together with his friend Samuel Hartlib, John Dewey attempted to define the fundamental articles of faith, which all Protestants would accept. Фундаментальные основания веры. They both actively communicated with Lutheran and Calvinist theologians. The events of the 1640s in England were central in Dewey's understanding of the historical process. He considered them to be a part of ongoing Reformation. Addressing English Parliament in 1646, he said that, quote, God had since the beginning of the reformation of his church from popery and anti-Christian superstition intended to bring his vessels out of Babylon into Sion. Я попробую это перевести на русский. Бог имел намерение с начала реформации своей церкви от папства и антихристианских суеверий привести своих чад из Вавилона в Сион. In his opinion, the English Parliament was the principal agent of reformation, and the reformation itself was necessary in all fields of life, not only in religion and politics, but also in the sphere of education. John Dьюри, as well as his friend Hartley, did not limit reformation to England, but aimed at universal reformation, at the ecclesiastical reform across entire Europe. The idea of the universal reformation also implied the question of the relationship between human and divine will. Соотношение между божественной и человеческой волей. John Dьюри had a balanced vision of this relationship. He thought his own actions can be part of the fulfillment of God's desires. Houston calls his approach a cycle of optimism and reform. The improvement of the society was a sign of the oncoming millennium, and the oncoming of the millennium meant it was necessary to improve the society, to prepare for it. Such was God's will. Dьюри wanted to build the city of God, which was for him a practical way of achieving salvation. The educational reform was one of those helping to build the city of God. In his pamphlet, The Reformed School, 1648, he described an ideal boarding school for boys in detail, not only paying attention to the curriculum, but also to the building, equipment, and the needs of the staff. In his discourse of Reformation, Dьюри placed educational reform above all the others. Quote, "It is evident that without the reformation of the ways of education in the schools, it will be impossible to bring any other reformation." End of quote. Nevertheless, Dьюri's reforms were not limited to school. His writings included the first work on librarianship, the Reformed Library Keeper from 1650, and even the Reformed Spiritual Husbandman from 1652, in collaboration with Samuel Hartley. Now about his wife, Dorothea Mur Dьюри. Dorothea Mur Dьюри had been known as a highly educated and pious woman long before her marriage to John Dьюri in 1645. She left quite a few letters, but contrary to John, she did not use the word reformation in her writings. Nevertheless, she also strove for educational reform and for purification of the human spiritual and social life. Dorothy questioned the place of women in the Christian church and her own role as the member of the church. She also dismissed social and class prejudices, vindicating her unequal marriage to a man who was not a nobleman. Dorothy Mur, born King, belonged to a family of English colonists in Ireland. Her father, Sir John King, owned extensive estates in this country and was knighted in 1609. Besides Dorothy, at least one of Sir King's 9 children became very famous. It was Edward King, a young man famous for his knowledge, who drowned in 1637 and became the subject of Milton's elegy, Lycidas. Dorothy was born in Dublin in 1612 or 1613. It is difficult to say what kind of education Dorothy Mur obtained in her childhood. In her letters we find sharp criticism of female education of her time, which focused on dancing and needlecraft. Nevertheless, by 1640, she had been famous for her learning and knowledge of classical languages, above all Latin and Hebrew. At the end of the 1620s, Dorothy married the younger son of the Earl of Drogheda, author Moore. She became a relative of Catherine Boyle, later Lady Rayner, by the way, the sister of the famous scientist Robert Boyle. In the 1630s, Dorothy traveled to the Netherlands together with her husband, who had been dead by 1641. She was a widow with 2 children and had to reconsider her life and her role in the society. In the late 1630s, Moore became acquainted with 2 important people in her life. One of them was Anna Maria van Schurman, famous for her numerous talents as well as for her dissertation on whether a Christian woman should be educated. The other was John Dьюри. It was Schurman who proposed to an author of the excellence of the female sex, Johann van Beverwyck, to include Moore as an example of a learned woman. Beverwyck described Dorothy Moore as, quote, the widow of an English nobleman, not yet 27 years of age, adorned with all the graces of body and soul. In a short time she learned Italian and French to such an extent that she could read works written in both languages and spoke French fluently. This encouraged her to study Latin, which she also mastered soon. Not stopping there, she embarked on the study of Hebrew, in which she progressed so far in a few months that she could read the Bible in that language. In addition, she is so devout that in between her studies, she sets aside a special time each day to spend piously reading and meditating. A little while ago, she wrote a letter in Hebrew to the most learned maid that ever lived, who needs no further introduction here. End of quote. Sorry, it was a little bit long, but there is not much first-hand material about this woman apart from her letters, so it's quite relevant. It was in 1639. Being a mother of 2 children, Dorothy Moore wanted to know how to combine household matters with spiritual calling. While Schurman supported education of leisured women who were not burdened with families, Moore was interested in female education in the home. As Lynette Cantor states in her introduction to Letters of Dorothy Moore, Van Schurman wants a general study of science and wisdom, while Moore specifically wants access to theological knowledge and discussion. Being not only a deeply religious person, but also a woman who wanted to do some kind of religious service in public, Moore concentrated on this question and contacted Schurman's close friend, a Calvinist theologian, André Rivet, to clarify this matter for herself. Rivet was clear about the possibility of women's preaching. As Carol Paul puts it, for Rivet, women were never intended to preach. The times of early church passed by. The contemporary church did not need women for public service, for example, for baptizing. Although quite supportive for women pursuing intellectual activities, Rivet was against female engagement in church service. Moore's letters from 1643 reveal her ideas on woman's place in Christian community. In these letters, she tries to overcome a contradiction between her spiritual calling to be a preacher, or at least to hold any public service within the church, and her sex. In a letter to Catherine Rayner, Dorothy says she has, quote, been long of this opinion that everyone whose conscience doth evidence in any measure a union with Christ ought to make it their principal aim. То есть союз со Христом для каждого должен быть главной целью. She does not see everyone as only every man, but every man and woman. Quote, I judge him or her obliged to seek those qualifications and graces earnestly, which may give an ability to some measure to fulfill this aim. End of quote. Moore criticizes those who think women altogether incapable of such service. She points out she does not exclude our sex. Moore considers all kinds of women, such as are married and those that are unmarried. The task for the first group is to take care of their husbands, children, and family, but those in the second group ought either to marry to this end or find out some employment. Attributing herself to the second group, she chooses the last option, quote, that is either to stand in relation to some great person or to take up a cause of instructing youth of my own sex, end of quote. Moore chooses the service of instructing youth as she wants to make her own sex considerable in the task of the advancement of the kingdom of Christ in their spirits. Being a part of a network of scholarly women around Anna Maria von Schurman, she knew herself and heard about outstanding women who were both learned and pious. Moore was willing to contribute to the process of bringing up more women like them. Her other reason of choosing the teaching path was her aversion to an idle life which neither profits others nor myself, that is in regard of conscience. Moore was an active person striving to help others and to find self-realization through such help. In her opinion, knowledge without practical application was absurd. Thus, she shared with Bushers and Dewey the idea of practical knowledge. The same unwillingness to do nothing and to conform to an ideal of a silent woman is clear in Moore's letters to André Rivet. Contrary to letters to her close friend Catherine Boyle, 3 letters to Rivet are formal and more attention is paid to female modesty. In her first letter, she poses 2 questions. First, to ascertain whether or not the Christian women who are united in Christ and consequently members of his body should propose as their principal goal the service of the saints of the body in the communion of the saints, yes or no? And second, to ascertain for myself by which path the female sex can or should pursue this goal without going against the modesty required of their sex and without passing outside the limits which have been laid down for women. End of quote. 2 слова по-русски. Первый вопрос был общий. Должны ли женщины-христианки считать службу в сообществе святых главным в своей жизни? А второй вопрос, какой путь ей самой избрать, чтобы не переступить пределы, положенные для ее пола, так сказать, общественным мнением. Moore wants to go further in action according to my capacity. In her next letter to Rivet, she continues questioning woman's place and role in the church. She insists women should be allowed to serve the public as members of the mysterious body because they are incorporated in Christ in the same way as you, men, are. Moore recalls the days of the early church when widowed women served as deacons, helpers at baptism. They had a semi-ecclesiastical role in watching over women, teaching them and compelling them to perform their duties regarding their husbands and children. She does not propose explicitly to revive this practice, but she does not want women to be neglected in the church. Moore also questions the limits of studying for women. Her problem is women are absolutely forbidden to exercise these spiritual gifts in public. As she does not value knowledge without application, she tries to understand what should be learned by women and how they can make their knowledge useful for the public. Dorothy Moore's interest in the education of women began in the times when she lived in Utrecht and communicated, among the others, with Anna Maria von Schurman. Around 1650, she finally received a call, most probably from Lady Reinla, to consider the manner of the education of the youth of our sex. Dorothy wrote a short treatise of the education of girls, dedicated primarily to the criticism of contemporary way of teaching young women. She said she left out the teaching of youth dancing and curious works, both which serve only to fill the fancy with unnecessary, unprofitable and proud imaginations. She also rejects the practice to teach girls dressing, curling and such like. Dorothy Moore does not find the ground for such things in reason or religion. She makes the conclusion that generally our sex in this kingdom minds nothing but idleness and pleasure, and live as not using reason nor knowing God, who hath declared that we must account for every idle word and thought. Rejecting idleness for herself, Dorothy Moore accuses the whole system of female education of bringing young women into this state, which is, in her opinion, damaging for their souls. And a short conclusion. John and Dorothea Dewey's plans for educational reform complemented each other. While John paid more attention to boys' education, Dorothy focused on female education. To some degree, Dorothy was bolder than her husband. She questioned female role in the church and explicitly criticized class prejudices. On the other hand, John Dewey's ideas were more universal. He was a tolerant man, born to be a pacificator. Joint consideration of John's and Dorothy's writings and activities shed light on their further reformation in England in the middle of the 17th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the report. For some questions.
Was she regarded in the later pedagogues as a kind of pattern for education, or was she completely forgotten because she didn't fit in? Covered maybe.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, to tell the truth, because this treatise, it existed only in manuscript, and it was intended for publication by Samuel Hartley, who had a huge plan of educational reforms together with Dewey and together with Comenius. But for some strange reason, which, to tell the truth, I'm going to study deeper, it was not published. It was not published, and her letters had not been published until the year, I'll try to have a look which ones, 2004. So, but before that, yes, some of her letters were published together with Hartley's correspondence, maybe in the 1940s or 1950s, but separately, her letters were published only in 2004 in a separate edition, and then she, of course, attracted more attention from the scholars. Because, of course, she's one of those reformers of education, of women education in England in the mid-17th century. Yes, not maybe her views on education were so radical, but she had a very, I didn't tell about it in this paper. I concentrated more on the general issues of what is further reformation, in my opinion, and in others' opinions too. But what is interesting, she had a very interesting concept of inner light. She had a very interesting concept of inner light, very close to Quakers, to the Quakers. Yes, and there was a question recently, did she have any relationship with Quakers? But there were no Quakers at that time. In 1649 there were no Quakers yet. And so this is very interesting, of course, all these connections. And she was, yes, she was quite radical and very straightforward. And she didn't fit. She was a noblewoman of a very high nobility. She married a man who was not a nobleman. She wrote a letter explaining that, in her opinion, nobility is nothing. The nobleness of the soul is everything. So it's very interesting, yes, very socialist to some degree. Yeah, so yes, maybe she didn't fit, yes. Maybe she was forgotten because almost no her writings were published in her lifetime and after that.
Very interesting, yes. How did you come to this theme? I mean, this Dewey.
You see, she is a part of the network around Anna Maria von Schulman, and I tell lies how I found Anna Maria von Schulman. After I finished my PhD on Afro Ben, who is the first professional woman writer in England in the 17th century, my interest in women writers and women intellectuals extended and of this period, and I came first on Anna Maria von Schulman, who was quite famous, and after that I started studying her network, and there were very good works about it, and Dorothee Moore was a part of it, and then I found this book of her letters. But on the whole, she is also connected with Comenius, whom I admire, and whose two volumes of writings I have read, and in Russian, of course, and to Hartlib, who was a very interesting hub in the whole Republic of Letters of the 17th century, a very important figure, very interesting. And through that to Moore and to Dewry, whom I find a very interesting figure too.
Thank you very much.
What was she really